My name is Jennifer Pan. In 2010, I was convicted of orchestrating a kill-for-hire attack against my own parents in our Unionville, Ontario home. The motive behind this dreadful act was my parents' controlling behavior and their strong disapproval of my boyfriend Daniel Wong. Me and an old high school classmate went through a series of connections to hire 3 gunmen to kill my parents. After I left the door open for them that night, they took my parents into the basement and shot them multiple times. After my 3rd interview with the authorities, I confessed to the crime and was found guilty of multiple charges and sentenced to life imprisonment. The court ruled that I would be eligible for parole after 25 years. As of May 2023, the Court of Appeal for Ontario made a decision to order a retrial for me and my fellow conspirators on the first-degree murder charge.
On the night of November 8, 2010, at 10:15 p.m., a desperate 911 call came through from a quiet suburban street in Markham, Ontario. Jennifer's trembling voice echoes faintly. "Please hurry. They shot my parents." The sound cuts off. Silence follows. Jennifer Pan was the eldest child of Vietnamese immigrants, Han and Bitch Pan. They had built a life in Canada through hard work and sacrifice. To friends and neighbors, the Pans were a proud, close family. Jennifer was their daughter who had always been expected to achieve, disciplined, well-mannered, and, by appearances, devoted. But that night, inside their family home, nothing was as it seemed. Flashes, the Pan family home, police lights on a dark street, a courtroom sketch, Jennifer's mugshot. A phone call meant to signal tragedy would become the starting point of a mystery. Was this the voice of a victim, or something far more complicated? How far can pressure push a child? And when does control transform into betrayal? In order to understand the night of November 8, 2010, we must begin decades earlier, thousands of miles away from that quiet Canadian suburb. We must go back to the story of 2 parents, Han and Bitch Pan, whose journey would shape the destiny of their daughter in ways no one could ever have predicted. Han and Bitch were Vietnamese immigrants. They carried with them the trauma of war, displacement, and the hunger for stability that often defines those who leave everything behind in search of a better life. Like many who fled Southeast Asia in the 1970s, they worked tirelessly to carve out something new in a foreign country. They carried little more than determination, but determination was enough. It was enough to set them on a path of building a life in Canada, where freedom was not just a word, but an opportunity. Their beginnings were modest. Scarborough, a working-class area east of Toronto, became their first home. Life was simple but hard, every dollar earned through long shifts and careful saving. Han secured work as a tool and die maker at an auto parts company, while Bitch supported the household with equal devotion, balancing jobs and motherhood. For years, they lived without luxury, placing value instead on security, reputation, and family honor. What they lacked in ease, they compensated for in discipline, and what they dreamed of, they poured into their children. By the time the Pans had established themselves enough to move into Markham, Ontario, the family's future seemed clear. Markham was a growing suburb, a place where immigrant families found community, where ambition was not only possible but expected. Here, the Pans would raise their children with one unwavering mission: to succeed. In their minds, respect for elders was not negotiable. Dating was forbidden. Rebellion was unacceptable. Han and Bitch raised their daughter Jennifer and later their son Felix under a code of achievement, sacrifice, and restraint. To Han, discipline was love. To Bitch, obedience was the shield against chaos. Their parenting carried the echoes of their past. In Vietnam, survival had demanded toughness. In Canada, survival would demand excellence. Jennifer was their firstborn, the one on whom their hopes rested most heavily. From the very beginning, her days were tightly scheduled. There was piano, hours at the keyboard, mastering the works of Mozart and Beethoven, not for leisure but for mastery. There was skating, early mornings at the rink, training with the rigor of an athlete in pursuit of perfection. And there was school, where the expectation was nothing less than the honor roll. Every grade was scrutinized, every achievement celebrated, but also measured against what more could be done. If she earned an A, the question was always why it wasn't an A+. Neighbors and relatives saw a girl who seemed destined for greatness, shaped by parents who believed sacrifice today would guarantee a better tomorrow. To them, Jennifer was the model daughter, polite, studious, and talented. She bowed her head when spoken to by elders, spoke softly, and rarely challenged authority. Yet behind every public appearance was the weight of silent pressure, invisible but constant, a reminder that love was tied to achievement, that her value was measured by success. The voice of her father lingered over her daily life, echoing with a conviction that admitted no weakness. Excellence is not an option. It is the only way. These words, remembered by those who knew the family, were not a suggestion. They were an instruction, a creed by which Jennifer was expected to live. To Han, this was guidance. To Jennifer, it was law. The Pan household did not entertain negotiation. Friendships were closely monitored. Social outings were rare. The expectation was study, practice, and more study. For every birthday party missed, there was the promise of future stability. For every late night spent practicing piano, there was the vision of medical school, of status, of respect. This was the contract of her childhood, sacrifice now, rewards later. And though Jennifer smiled and complied, the question remained. Was this compliance rooted in devotion or in fear? As Jennifer grew, so did the demands. Her adolescence was not marked by rebellion, but by quiet compliance. Unlike her peers, who experimented with independence, Jennifer remained tethered to her parents' rules. Dating was forbidden, even discussed as a betrayal of her family's expectations. Leisure was framed as wasteful, and in the Pan household, mediocrity was indistinguishable from failure. This structure created the image of a perfect daughter, but also the burden of being flawless. Jennifer was to be the proof of her parents' sacrifice, the evidence that their immigration had meaning. To Han and Bitch, anything less than excellence was unthinkable. To Jennifer, excellence began to feel unreachable. And here lies the tension at the heart of this story. When achievement is demanded without limit, what becomes of the child who cannot reach the standard? What becomes of the daughter who is taught that love is conditional? The narrator's voice drops lower, slower, the words punctuated with weight. But what happens when excellence becomes impossible? High school should have been a straight line for Jennifer Pan, yet it bent early, and it bent hard. The courses that once felt manageable began to press from all sides, and the subjects her parents prized most, math and science, demanded a precision she could not consistently deliver. She studied late and rose early, and the numbers still resisted her. Test scores slid, unit by unit, until the distance between expectation and reality felt like a gulf. In hallways filled with chatter about labs and exams, she carried a quiet dread that attached itself to every quiz and midterm. The Pan home asked for excellence and accepted little else, and the margin for error narrowed as semesters stacked up. Each term ended not with relief, but with calculation. How to bring the story at home in line with the facts at school. Her first step was small, almost tentative. A mark adjusted before it reached the kitchen table. A single letter nudged upward so the conversation would be brief and proud rather than long and searching. The altered page slid across the dining room with a practiced hand, and the reaction, relief in her mother's eyes, firmness in her father's voice, taught her that the cost of telling the truth felt higher than the cost of changing it. What began as one rescue became a method. One term turned into another, and the changes grew more confident, the signatures more exact. The desk lamp became a companion on quiet nights, the sound of paper smoothing under palm, the slow, careful strokes that made a B look like an A, and look like something no one would challenge. Each success bought time, and each success deepened the trap. As the coursework advanced, anxiety did too, and it did not travel alone. It brought racing thoughts, sleeplessness, and the constant planning required to keep parallel lives aligned. Teachers spoke about course averages and final exam weightings, and she listened while also counting the conversations she would need to manage at home. In class, she answered to her transcript. At home, she answered to a vision of her future that never faltered in her parents' telling. The strain did not explode outward. It folded inward and hardened, and the habit of concealment became routine. She learned which comments to nod at, which details to omit, and how to hold eye contact long enough to seem assured. The lie was never loud, yet it grew. When a forged grade was not enough to defend the larger story, documents followed, clean, official-looking pages that spoke the language her family trusted. Certificates appeared to mark milestones that had not been reached, and each one felt like armor. A printed border, a seal, a line of congratulatory wording that made sense to anyone who wanted to believe. The awards were not about status so much as structure. They held together a version of progress that could be shown to others without opening space for doubt. The result was a record that looked complete from a distance and passed casual inspection up close. And the pride it produced inside the Pan household made it harder to stop. With every artifact accepted, the expectation to produce the next artifact hardened into a requirement. Then came the season of applications, and with it, the reality that friends were planning moves and mapping out programs, while she faced thresholds she could not cross with grades alone. Classmates compared offer letters. They discussed residence assignments and course enrollment dates, and social media filled with photos and countdowns. The room where she studied felt smaller, and the conversations at lunch became harder to join, because each happy announcement from a friend also reminded her of the distance she had to cover in silence. When decisions arrived by email and envelope, a different plan took shape, not a path through admissions, but a story that mimicked one. She announced an acceptance to Ryerson University, and the household lit up in relief and pride, because it sounded exactly like what should happen next. The mechanics of that story were careful and layered, an offer that could be shown, a schedule that explained her absences, and a language of student life that echoed what others were saying without inviting follow-up questions she couldn't answer. She referenced course codes and timetables pulled from online listings. She mentioned buildings and professors' last names picked from public pages. She brought home textbooks that supported the script and placed them where they would be seen. Her days, however, did not route to lecture halls and labs. They threaded through libraries, cafes, and quiet spaces where no one would ask to see an ID card or a completed assignment. The goal was consistency, not conquest, to be seen as moving forward while standing still. As semesters rolled on and friends posted about midterms and practicums, the story at home advanced as well. A transfer narrative, the kind families celebrate because it signals ambition and improvement. Ryerson became the bridge to something grander. The University of Toronto became the destination. Pharmacology became the field that matched her parents' hopes with precision. The arcs sounded right, competitive, respectable, stable, and that correctness wrapped the entire plot in credibility. She downloaded syllabi, she cited exam periods, and she brought home the markers of a life she could describe in detail because she had studied the map, even if she never traveled it. Each layer made the next easier to accept and harder to challenge. In Markham, neighbors heard proud updates on evening walks and at weekend gatherings. Their daughter was in a demanding program. Their sacrifices were paying off, and the future looked secure. Han's voice, steady and certain, carried the news in a way that discouraged doubt. Bitch's smile completed the message. These moments mattered. They were the harvest the family had worked years to plant, and the community understood the story because many families around them had pursued the same path. Pride moved outward in rings, and in those rings, the lie found shelter. To question her would be to question the larger dream, and few people are eager to do that when the dream sounds earned. Meanwhile, maintaining the second life required timekeeping as much as storytelling, and the calendar became an instrument. Class blocks penciled in, exam periods noted, holidays aligned with campus closures. She rehearsed answers for ordinary questions. When is your lab? Which campus are you on this term? How are your marks? The replies arrived smoothly because they had been prepared, and the preparation itself dulled the edges of fear for a while. Yet fear returned in the quiet moments. A call that might come from a relative asking specifics, a chance encounter with a former teacher, a sudden question from her father that asked for detail beyond the script. She lived in the in-between, always almost safe, never entirely so. There were close calls, and they taught her how to tighten the presentation without admitting the truth. A request to meet an academic advisor was deflected with talk of scheduling conflicts. An invitation to a campus event was declined with the explanation of a late lab. A push to see a physical diploma was redirected toward the next milestone to be reached. Each deflection worked, yet each also left a residue. The uneasy knowledge that a single document, a single check, could end everything. The weight of that knowledge did not pass. It settled, and she learned to carry it by moving faster. What made the performance durable was not just her preparation, but the alignment between the script and her parents' expectations. The story fit so well that it confirmed rather than challenged their belief about what a devoted daughter would do. Pharmacology sounded like responsibility. The University of Toronto sounded like prestige. Long hours away from home sounded like commitment. When she spoke in those terms, the conversation ended quickly because pride answered for her. In that economy of trust, the smallest proof, a textbook on the table, a schedule on the fridge, did more work than a long explanation ever could. And the longer the performance lasted, the more dangerous it became to stop, because stopping would require not just an admission but a reckoning. Years to be unwound, conversations to be reopened, respect to be renegotiated. At family dinners, the talk of exams and labs kept the table steady. At night, the thought of being found out turned steady breath shallow. She told herself the break would come later, after this term, after this exam period, after this summer, and later kept moving. The horizon never arrived, and the act extended to meet it. All the while, the world beyond school kept moving with its own rhythm. Friends posted first-day photos in campus colors. They worried aloud about finals, and then posted relief when finals ended. They shared the small victories of student life that are ordinary and bright. She watched, and the contrast stung, because their stress came with progress, and hers did not. They were tired for a reason. She was tired because she held up a ceiling alone. The comparison did not need to be spoken to do its work. Inside the Pan home, updates continued, and they continued to sound right. Han told co-workers about course loads. Bitch repeated touches of the story on phone calls with extended family. Both parents framed their daughters' long days as evidence of direction. They were not naive. They were convinced, and conviction produces its own kind of blindness, especially when the picture in front of you confirms the hope you have carried for years. If you believe your child is fulfilling the path you laid down, you are less inclined to inspect the stones beneath each step. The portrait, then, was complete enough to impress, and incomplete enough to crack. An altered mark sheet defended one conversation. A certificate quieted another. The claim of transfer elevated the plan. The field of study soothed every doubt. Yet the questions did not disappear. They waited. Where were the transcripts? Where were the official email threads? Where was the student account a parent might log into and see? The answers to those questions were always deferred, and deferral, like any skill, improved with practice. These were not the actions of someone seeking attention. They were the measures of someone trying to outrun a standard she could not meet and a fear she could not name. By the time the performance reached full size, it had a schedule, a vocabulary, and a set of props. It had a public, too, because pride is public by nature. The deeper truth, that she was failing to meet the bar she had been told never to miss, stayed locked behind tightly managed smiles and prepared replies. The performance promised safety and delivered pressure. What stands out, when viewed from a distance, is how ordinary the ingredients were: a printer, a pen, a list of classes, a stack of books, a schedule on a refrigerator. Nothing dramatic, nothing that announces danger on sight. Only small tools arranged to build a story that felt normal because it was designed to feel normal. That ordinariness is what let it pass. That ordinariness is also what made it perilous, because ordinary lies are easy to repeat. And in the gap between school and home, another gap opened, one that did not concern grades or programs, but life beyond both. As she rehearsed the language of lectures and labs, she also began to guard a private set of choices that could never be squared with the rules posted on the walls of the Pan household. The skill of hiding one reality to preserve another does not stay in one lane. It travels, and it teaches a person how to split a day into halves that never meet. That habit would soon matter more than any forged page. So the questions linger, and they are not idle. Why did no one notice, when so much hinged on the truth? And how long could she keep the act alive, when every new layer made discovery both less likely today and more devastating tomorrow? High school band was never supposed to change the direction of Jennifer Pan's life, yet it did. In a setting far removed from her parents' rigid routines, Jennifer found herself surrounded by music, laughter, and a rhythm that allowed students to simply breathe. It was here that she met Daniel Wong. While her world at home was ruled by order and silence, Daniel's world carried a different energy, light, fun, and unrestrained. He laughed easily, spoke casually, and carried himself with the kind of freedom Jennifer had only ever seen from a distance. The contrast between her two worlds could not have been sharper: a daughter bound by discipline, and a teenager who suddenly felt the first pull of affection. Jennifer and Daniel's friendship began innocently enough, through shared rehearsals and conversations in between practice. Yet over time, those conversations stretched, first into lingering phone calls, then into messages that carried a different weight. Daniel offered her something she had never been given at home: encouragement without conditions. He wasn't measuring her worth through grades or demanding excellence at every turn. With him, she felt a sense of acceptance that no report card could ever guarantee. Their text exchanges grew warmer, filled with jokes and hopeful whispers about life beyond high school, about choices they could one day make for themselves. It was not simply romance. It was escape, and escape felt intoxicating. But in the Pan household, dating was more than a distraction. It was forbidden. Han and Bitch had carved their lives out of sacrifice, and to them, love was a luxury that could derail a carefully built future. When Han learned that Jennifer was seeing Daniel, his disapproval came swift and absolute. He made it clear that her path did not include boyfriends or wasted time. "No distractions," he told her firmly. "You are here to succeed, not to waste your life." The words were not a suggestion. They were an order, one that reflected his conviction that every hour should be spent on academics, every ounce of energy reserved for achievement. For many young women, a father's disapproval might have ended the relationship, but Jennifer had already learned to build her life around secrets. Just as she had adjusted grades and forged awards to preserve her parents' pride, she now adjusted her routines to preserve her relationship with Daniel. Outwardly, she complied, promising her father she had ended things. Inwardly, she continued, slipping away under the guise of study sessions, hiding phone calls late at night, and keeping her messages tucked safely behind practiced lies. It was a deception that mirrored the one she had already perfected with her academics. Two separate lives, one shown to her parents and another guarded fiercely in private. Daniel, for his part, became more than a boyfriend. He became the symbol of everything Jennifer longed for. With him, she laughed without fear of judgment. With him, she pictured a life not governed by schedules or report cards. While Han's voice told her that worth came only through discipline, Daniel's presence reminded her that there was a world where choice and joy could coexist. The more her father pushed, the more she clung to Daniel. Their bond strengthened not in spite of the restrictions, but because of them. The very act of hiding their relationship made it feel like something worth protecting at all costs. The contrast between her obedience at home and her rebellion in secret carved a dangerous duality. In her parents' eyes, Jennifer was still the respectful daughter who bowed her head, practiced piano, and spoke softly at the dinner table. But with Daniel, she was someone else entirely, free, vibrant, and unburdened by expectations. The psychological weight of these two identities pressed on her daily. She learned to switch roles seamlessly, moving from one world to the other without letting them collide. Yet with each passing month, the distance between the daughter she pretended to be and the woman she was becoming grew wider. Maintaining that divide required skill, and Jennifer had it. She became fluent in deception, constructing believable alibis, crafting stories about exams, group projects, and study groups that gave her the space to see Daniel. The same ingenuity that allowed her to invent university schedules now allowed her to keep a relationship alive in the shadows. Each secret she guarded seemed manageable in the moment, but each one carried weight, a kind of debt that collected interest. At school, her classmates prepared for futures that were real. At home, her parents clung to a vision that wasn't. And in the middle, Jennifer held tightly to Daniel, because with him she could breathe. But lies, no matter how carefully built, are fragile. They carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. Jennifer had constructed one lie around her academics, another around her love life, and both demanded constant maintenance. Each excuse, each hidden phone call, each fabricated story pulled her deeper into a world where truth could never be spoken aloud. It was only a matter of time before the threads began to unravel. But every lie carries an expiration date. By the time Jennifer Pan reached her early 20s, the world she presented to her parents had become nothing more than a carefully rehearsed act. Each morning she rose, packed her bag with books, and left the house with the same quiet assurance of a university student heading to class. Han and Bitch believed she was traveling downtown to the University of Toronto, attending lectures in pharmacology, preparing for the career that would honor their sacrifice. But her days unfolded far from any lecture hall. She built a routine of deceit, one that demanded precision and nerve, a life where every story had to match the next. Her charade required movement. Instead of attending labs or seminars, she spent her hours in cafes scattered across Markham and Scarborough, nursing cups of coffee while flipping through borrowed textbooks. At times she went to Daniel Wong's apartment, their relationship flourishing in the privacy she carved out with lies. On other days she picked up shifts at small jobs, money that provided spending cash, and served as a convincing explanation for time spent away from campus. From the outside, it looked like the life of a busy student balancing school, work, and a social life. In reality, it was a shell, and Jennifer was the actor who never left the stage. Documents anchored the illusion. She forged syllabi, matching fonts and layouts to those used by real professors. When her parents asked for evidence, she produced transcripts that looked official, marks adjusted upward to maintain the myth of progress. She even invented a volunteer placement at Sick Kids Hospital, telling stories about working with children, shifts that explained late arrivals home or weekend absences. Each piece of paper, each detail, was crafted with care. To Han and Bitch, they were proof of their daughter's ambition. To Jennifer, they were armor, protecting her from exposure while also tightening the cage she had built around herself. The cost of maintaining the performance fell on her parents without their knowledge. They paid tuition they believed was real, money scraped from years of hard work in a factory and long hours of household sacrifice. They drove her to stations, fed her, supported her, and carried her story into the community. At family gatherings, they spoke proudly of their daughter, the pharmacy student who was destined for success. Neighbors nodded with respect, relatives beamed with pride, and the Pans felt vindicated. They had fled hardship in Vietnam and built a future in Canada, and Jennifer was proof their labor had meaning. The tragedy was that all of it was built on sand. Inside this world of invention, her bond with Daniel grew stronger. With him, she was not the disciplined student or the obedient daughter. She was simply Jennifer, laughing, affectionate, and alive in a way her father's rules had never allowed. They exchanged constant messages, filled with plans of a future together, apartments they might share, trips they might take, a life lived without curfews or expectations. With every secret meeting at his apartment, with every conversation that stretched into the early hours of the morning, her attachment deepened. The freedom Daniel represented was intoxicating, but it also tied her more tightly to the lies she told her parents. Without the deception, there would be no space for the relationship. Her life became a daily balancing act, and the stakes rose with every passing week. If she said she had a shift at Sick Kids, she had to remember the details of the ward she claimed to work in. If she told her parents she had a midterm, she needed to know the date and subject in case they asked. If she claimed to be working late, she had to coordinate with Daniel to keep her story intact. The lies multiplied until they covered every hour of her day. But managing a lie is like juggling glass. It works until the first drop, and then everything shatters. At home, Han and Bitch remained blind to the performance. Han's watchful eye saw nothing amiss. Jennifer answered questions with confidence and provided documents when asked. Bitch's gentle encouragement reinforced her daughter's role, proud of her volunteer work and long study hours. The family believed so fully in her story that it became impossible to doubt. Who questions success when every piece of evidence confirms it? Who wants to believe their child is deceiving them when the alternative is so much brighter? Yet behind Jennifer's steady performance was a different reality. She lived with fear, fear of being discovered, fear of watching her father's pride turn to anger, fear of the collapse that would follow if even one page of her story was proven false. The anxiety kept her alert, but it also kept her trapped. She could not admit the truth without dismantling years of lies, and she could not keep lying without digging the hole deeper. What began as a way to protect herself had become the only way she knew how to live. With Daniel, She confessed none of this weight to him. She spoke of love and freedom, building castles in the air about the life they would one day have. He was her relief, her escape, and her hope. But he was also her risk, because every hour spent with him required another story at home, another forged detail, another performance. The deception that allowed her relationship to survive also ensured that her parents could never know who she really was. The more she leaned on Daniel, the more she needed the lies that allowed him to remain in her life. As months turned into years, Jennifer's two lives drifted further apart, but the effort to keep them both alive demanded more energy than she could admit. Her parents praised her as a rising success, neighbors admired her progress, and relatives held her up as a model child. In quiet corners of cafes and behind closed doors at Daniel's apartment, she was someone else entirely. Two versions of Jennifer coexisted, one celebrated, one hidden, and she was the only person who knew how fragile the distance between them truly was. The narrator's voice tightens, deliberate and measured. Was Jennifer lying only to protect herself, or had the act become the foundation for something much darker? By early 2010, the neat story Jennifer Pan had handed her parents no longer felt solid under inspection, and the shift began with small things that did not add up. Han noticed there were no heavy textbooks coming through the door at exam time, no lab goggles or kits, no real schedules taped to a wall that should have been crowded with dates and deadlines. He asked simple questions any parent might ask. Which course meets first? Which building is the midterm in? Who is the professor? And the answers came quickly, yet they came without the kind of detail that grows naturally from lived routine. Weeks passed, and nothing about her daily rhythm seemed to track with a demanding university program. There were late returns, but few explanations that bore weight. A father who prized order and proof began to feel the absence of both, and suspicion settled where pride had lived. The more he looked, the less he saw, and the less he saw, the harder he looked. The truth did not arrive in pieces. It landed all at once, and it hit like a fall through thin ice. In 2010, Han learned that Jennifer had never actually graduated high school, and with that single fact, the entire story of university lectures, pharmacology labs, and volunteer shifts collapsed in seconds. What he believed were semesters had been performances, what he admired as endurance had been deception, and the daughter he held up to relatives as proof of sacrifice had been living outside the truth for years. The revelation was not just academic, it was personal, because for Han and Bitch, education was the language of survival, the validation of everything they had endured to build a life in Canada. Pride turned to shock, shock turned to anger, and under the anger lay a grief that had no words. Jennifer, who had feared this moment in quiet rooms and on long bus rides, now stood in it with nothing left to hide behind. What followed inside the Pan home was sharp and unyielding, and it moved with the force of a door slamming shut. Han confronted his daughter and pressed for answers, but answers could not rewind years or restore trust, and the scale of deception allowed little room for mercy. He laid down rules that left no space for negotiation. There would be no more lies, no more unaccounted hours, no contact with the boyfriend he already viewed as a distraction from duty. He forbade her from seeing Daniel Wong and set strict limits on her movements. If she left the house, it would be for reasons he approved and at times he controlled, and the quiet privileges of independence disappeared. Days shrank to the boundaries of home and essential errands. Nights were monitored, and the freedom that had allowed her to juggle two lives was suddenly gone. If she had felt confined before, she now learned what it meant to be watched. The rules reflected more than anger. They reflected a life philosophy rooted in sacrifice and structure, and they came from a man who believed control could still rescue the future. Han had crossed oceans to give his children ground to stand on, and in his mind, that ground was built from discipline, honesty, and relentless effort. Without those, everything cracked. To discover that the daughter he trusted had built a second world in secret struck at the very heart of that belief. So he tightened the frame the only way he knew how, with order, with surveillance, with demands. Bitch stood inside that frame as well, pained but supportive, wanting peace and restoration, yet understanding that consequences could not be avoided. The home grew quiet in a way that did not feel calm. It felt like pressure, and every conversation carried the ache of a wound not yet scabbed over. Jennifer lived inside that pressure, and it pressed from every side. Isolation arrived quickly, and it arrived with a heaviness that did not lift when morning came. Friends were kept at a distance, social time vanished, and the lifelines that had helped her balance deception and desire thinned until only one remained. Daniel still called, still texted, and his voice, once the soft background to a busy double life, became the steady beat in a room that suddenly felt too small. He spoke about their future and spoke about it often: an apartment together, jobs that would cover rent, a life arranged around their choices rather than rules made by others. For Jennifer, those words landed like air in a sealed space. They were comfort, and they were pressure, and they posed a choice she did not feel ready to make. She loved the promise inside those calls, yet every promise required a step she could not see how to take. Under the weight of lost trust and tightened control, her thoughts moved restlessly, and they searched for exits in places that were not built to hold them. First came the familiar reflex: more lies to cover the last lies. Yet even she understood that the mechanism was broken now, because scrutiny had replaced belief and quick answers no longer satisfied. Next came the idea of running, the clean break many young people picture when home no longer feels like refuge. Pack a bag, step out, start over. But running required savings she did not have, credentials she had not earned, and a plan that could withstand the first cold week, and facing those facts stripped the fantasy of its shine. The room remained small, the days remained rigid, and the problems remained the same when imagination stopped spinning. In that tightness, her mind drifted toward options that did not require permission, and each drift returned darker than the last. The tension inside the house did not explode every hour, but it did not relax either. It hummed, and it colored ordinary tasks with dread. Breakfasts were eaten with quiet forks. Questions about the day were short and practical. The look in Han's eyes searched and did not find what it needed. Jennifer felt the shame of exposure and the fear of what came next, and inside that mix, she also felt a small, stubborn anger. Not loud, not theatrical, but present, at a life that left so little room for human error. Daniel's messages met that anger and gave it language, and because his words affirmed her pain, they also sharpened her sense of what she deserved. The more she replayed the confrontation, the more she felt the choice was between surrender and self-destruction, and neither path looked survivable. She began to treat the future like a problem to be solved rather than a place to be reached. Han, for his part, was not a villain in his own mind. He was a father trying to rebuild a path he believed had kept the family safe since the day they arrived with almost nothing. He tightened curfews because he believed freedom had been misused. He restricted movement because movement had been the cover for deception. He cut off the boyfriend because the boyfriend represented drift. These decisions, harsh as they were, came from a code that had delivered food to the table and a roof over their heads, and abandoning that code felt like stepping into chaos. Yet love founded on control can feel like a wall, and walls keep danger out while also keeping despair in. And inside that paradox, everyone in the house began to harden. Bitch carried hope quietly, yet hope has difficulty breathing where trust has been torn. The home functioned, but it did not heal. Days collected, and with them collected the sense that time was not fixing what had broken, and that realization pulled Jennifer further into private calculation. She weighed outcomes like a student cramming for a test. Tell the truth again and face more anger. Leave and face the cold edge of uncertainty, or find a way to remove the obstacles that made both options feel impossible. It is in such calculus that judgment erodes, not all at once, but one rationalization at a time, and where a person who has long used deception to solve smaller problems begins to consider using it to solve a larger one. She told herself she was cornered, and a person who believes they are cornered looks for exits everyone else overlooked. The exits she began to see did not require diplomas or apologies. They required only a willingness to cross a line that most people never approach. Daniel's presence intensified that pull, not because he designed it, but because his certainty gave shape to choices she could not bring herself to name. He wanted a life with her, and he wanted it soon. He saw their bond as strong enough to justify hard decisions, and he saw her father's rules as unfair barriers that could be stepped over or stepped through. In calls and texts, he pointed toward a horizon that did not include curfews, interrogations, or constant supervision, and in a mind already trained to build stories that made the next day possible, those pointers felt like plans. She was not yet moving. She was imagining, and imagination, when fed by hurt and urgency, can begin to look like strategy. What love calls freedom, fear can call necessity, and between those two words, judgment blurs. Nothing about that spring and summer felt stable, and nothing about it felt safe. And the home that had once been the center of discipline now became the stage on which discipline and desperation faced each other without blinking. Jennifer woke under rules and went to sleep under rules, and in the hours between, she measured what rules remained and how many she could endure. Han watched a daughter he no longer recognized and tried to rebuild her with pressure. Bitch tended to quiet edges and tried to keep the air from breaking. Daniel waited outside the frame and said, again and again, that there was a way out if she chose it. Every element in that triangle pressed toward an answer, and the answer, once chosen, would not be reversible. When freedom feels impossible, what choices remain? After the confrontation in early 2010, Jennifer Pan did what she had always done when the pressure rose and the walls closed in. She reached for secrecy, and she reached for Daniel Wong. The rules at home were strict, the supervision constant, and contact with Daniel had been forbidden, yet their connection did not break. It shifted underground, moving through late-night texts, hushed phone calls, and meetings arranged with care. What began as messages of comfort and reassurance slowly changed tone. The language of affection gave way to the language of escape, and the questions they asked each other stopped being about how to get through the week and became questions about how to get out for good. The more Jennifer felt watched, the more she described her life as unlivable, and the more Daniel tried to offer a path that led away from her father's control. Together, they rehearsed the same dream. A small apartment, steady jobs, quiet evenings with no one to answer to. And together, they confronted the same problem. None of the usual exits were open to her. In those exchanges, a sentence appeared that did not sound like the others, and once written, it did not disappear. It came out first as frustration, then returned as a possibility, and finally sat in their chats like a dare neither of them wanted to speak aloud in plain terms. What if my dad wasn't here? It did not announce itself as a plan. It arrived as a pressure valve, a way to say out loud what she had been feeling in private. Yet ideas change when they are repeated, and repetition turns a feeling into a proposal. The more often that sentence showed up, the more it shaped what came next. Jennifer had spent years solving problems by building stories. Now she began to treat her father's presence as a problem that could be solved, and Daniel did not push the idea away. He let it stand, and standing, it gathered force. What followed was not a single step, but a series of attempts, each one testing the boundary between thought and action. Through Daniel, Jennifer reached toward people who claimed they could fix problems, men who said they knew how to make someone disappear for a price. The first approach faltered almost immediately. Numbers that rang without answers, meetings that never settled into details, a promise that sounded real at night and vanished by morning. The second try moved further. There was talk of timing. There were questions about her father's routine. There was a request for money up front. But that, too, dissolved under hesitation and mistrust. A third outreach circled back with new contact names and new assurances, and again the pattern repeated. A moment of agreement followed by silence, or a demand Jennifer could not meet under watch. Each failure should have been a warning. Instead, it became fuel. If one door would not open, she looked for another, and if one intermediary faltered, Daniel handed her a different one. In messages that would later be gathered and read line by line, the dissent took shape in practical language. Jennifer described the house, where the doors were, where the stairs ran, which windows were usually locked, which lights her parents left on at night. She detailed schedules, the time her father left for work, the hour he returned, the evenings when her mother watched television downstairs, the nights when quiet settled early. She asked what information was needed and filled in the blanks without delay, and the tone of those texts showed a change that mattered. She had moved from complaint to instruction, from a daughter protesting rules to a person mapping opportunity. Money followed the words, small transfers and cash handoffs that served two purposes at once: proof of commitment and purchase of silence. She did not have large sums, and she could not move freely, yet she found ways to send enough to keep conversations alive. All of this took place while the Pan home moved on with ordinary rhythms that the family believed were leading toward recovery. Han woke early and left for work, his trust shaken but his sense of duty unchanged. Bitch kept the house steady and tried to bring quiet back into the rooms. Relatives checked in and heard careful updates that sounded like progress. They did not know that, in the spaces between curfew and lights out, their daughter's phone lit up with instructions that would endanger them both. They did not know that her habit of building stories had hardened into something else, a habit of building scenarios that ended not with explanations, but with absence. Pride had turned to vigilance, and vigilance should have kept them safe, yet vigilance cannot guard against what it cannot see. Daniel's role in this period was not distant. He became the conduit through which thought was turned into logistics. He was the bridge to the men who said they could deliver an outcome, and he steadied Jennifer when her fears spiked or her resolve shook. He urged her to keep going when plans stalled. He pressed for timelines when conversations drifted. He framed each delay as temporary and each setback as evidence that they needed better help, not a different path. He told her there was a life waiting if she stepped into it, and he told her the life she was living would not change unless they made it change. To someone cornered, certainty sounds like rescue, and Daniel's certainty kept the idea alive when it should have died. After each failed attempt, Jennifer did not step back. She recalibrated. She adjusted the times she suggested. She refined the routes into and out of the house. She counted the variables that had spoiled prior efforts and tried to remove them one by one. Her messages grew more focused. Fewer complaints about being watched, more checklists about who would be home, which phones would be on, and where she would be positioned when the moment arrived. She offered to leave the door unlocked. She offered to signal with a light. She offered to make sure her father would be within reach. The practicality of her proposals showed a hard truth. The choice had passed from wish to will, and her planning reflected it. When deception becomes a reflex, escalation can feel like a continuation rather than a break, and that is what happened here. Money remained a constant thread. She sent what she could when she could, and when she could not send, she promised. Some transfers were small and immediate, meant to cover travel or a meeting. Others were framed as deposits toward a larger sum to be paid when the task was complete. She talked about insurance proceeds and future funds in vague terms, yet she spoke about them with enough confidence to keep interest on the other side of the text chain. Each payment carried its own logic. You do not fund what you do not intend, and each payment tightened the moral knot she had tied around herself. The more she paid, the harder it became to imagine walking backward into the truth. The messages did not exist in a vacuum. They became the ledger of her state of mind. There were hours when panic bled through and she typed too quickly, asking if it could be done sooner, asking if someone else could be used, asking if the amount demanded could be lowered or broken into parts. There were other hours when her words leveled out and took on the flat tone of a person describing a delivery route. After a plan fell apart, frustration surfaced, not relief that disaster had been averted, but irritation that a solution had been delayed. That emotional pattern mattered. It showed that the idea had become a goal, and the goal had become a timetable, and timetables do not tolerate drift. Meanwhile, the ordinary scenes at home made the impending break feel even more stark. Han checked locks before bed and asked brief questions that landed without answers. Bitch set the table and called her daughter to eat. The television in the living room filled the house with background noise that sounded like normal life. In that hum of routine, Jennifer kept the phone close, and the device that had once connected her to classmates and calendars now connected her to men who treated harm as a service. She had become the point of contact, the scheduler, the person who gathered inputs and gave direction, and in doing so, she crossed the line between imagining escape and arranging it. Daniel's encouragement did not waver. When she hesitated, he framed hesitation as fear her father had planted and fear she could uproot. When she expressed second thoughts after an approach collapsed, he called it noise that would pass, or he argued that their future required one more attempt with the right people. He did not shout, and he did not need to. The steady rhythm of his certainty replaced volume. In a world where she felt powerless, his voice offered power. In a house where she felt controlled, his messages offered control, and in a plan that depended on her cooperation, his presence made agreement feel like agency. That is how pressure works when it is dressed as promise. The logistics coalesced across late spring and summer, then hardened into specific windows as autumn neared. Jennifer wrote about the best nights and the worst nights, about where everyone would be and when, about how noise inside the home could cover noise at the door. She clarified which part of the house her mother used in the evenings and which part her father preferred when he returned from work. She updated the layout if furniture had been moved. She corrected details when a timing estimate proved wrong. She confirmed that her phone would be within reach and that she would be ready to act her part after the fact. Each clarification smoothed the path for strangers, and each smoothness made the unthinkable easier to imagine as inevitable. If there was a moment when she could have stepped back, it hid behind her habits. For years, she had managed crises by telling a better story, and now she tried to manage the largest crisis of her life by writing a script others would perform. She told herself that the plan would free her to be honest, that once the obstacle was gone she could live without deceit, and she did not dwell on the contradiction that her path to honesty required a deeper lie than any she had ever told. The mind makes bargains when it is cornered, and those bargains often read like truth to the person who needs them most. The failure of earlier attempts did not break the plan. It taught her how to present herself to the people she needed. She learned which questions would be asked and prepared answers that removed doubt. She learned to promise payment without sounding uncertain. She learned to keep the narrative focused on logistics rather than motive, because logistics feel clean and motive feels messy. The cadence of her messages matched the cadence of a person who has accepted an outcome and is now organizing delivery. That cadence carried her into the final stretch. Was this the portrait of a young woman crushed by control and reaching for the only door she thought remained, or the portrait of calculation, step by step, choice by choice, a plan treated like a task and a task treated like a solution? It was Monday, November 8th, 2010. The Pan household in Markham, Ontario, followed a rhythm as familiar as the ticking of the clock on the kitchen wall. Dinner had been eaten, the television hummed softly in the background, and by 9 p.m., Han and Bitch Pan were settling into the comfort of another quiet evening. To any neighbor walking past, it was a scene of ordinary family life. But inside, unseen, a string of text messages had already set a chain of events into motion, messages that marked the line between routine and ruin. At 9:12 p.m., Jennifer sent Daniel Wong a short confirmation. The door would be unlocked. Minutes later, further texts moved between them and the men Daniel had arranged. The words were clinical, stripped of affection, and carried only logistics, timing, entry, positions. By 9:30, her parents believed their daughter was upstairs studying. In reality, she was rehearsing a role she had written for herself. At 9:35, she texted that her father was in the living room and her mother was nearby. At 9:46, the reply came back, "We're close." At approximately 10:02 p.m., headlights cut briefly across the quiet suburban street. Three men stepped out of a dark vehicle and approached the Pan home. The front door gave way without resistance, just as Jennifer had promised. Armed and masked, they entered quickly, the sound of boots on hardwood announcing their presence with a finality that left no room for misinterpretation. Han looked up in confusion, startled by the intrusion, and Bitch barely had time to cry out before both were confronted at gunpoint. Upstairs, Jennifer waited, knowing the script was now unfolding in real time. The intruders moved with brutal efficiency. Jennifer, according to her later account, was grabbed and tied to the banister with a shoelace, her hands pulled behind her back. She called out in a trembling voice, but the restraint was loose enough that later investigators would question how confined she truly was. From her vantage point at the top of the staircase, she could hear everything below. Her parents were forced at gunpoint into the basement. Their steps hurried, their voices rising in fear. The basement, where years of family belongings were stored, where laundry machines hummed and boxes were stacked, became the stage for a crime that had been discussed for months, but was now horrifyingly real. The demands were shouted in harsh tones. Money, valuables, access to safes. Han and Bitch, bewildered and terrified, tried to comply, but compliance was never going to save them. The men ordered them to kneel. There was no appeal, no mercy. At approximately 10:14 p.m., gunshots tore through the silence. Bitch Pan was struck and killed instantly. Han was shot multiple times, bullets tearing into his body, and he collapsed, blood pooling across the concrete floor. The attackers believed they had finished their work. They left him to die beside his wife. Upstairs, Jennifer remained tied to the banister. The house was filled with the echo of gunfire, the footsteps of men leaving, and the sound of her own controlled breathing. Moments after the intruders fled, she reached for the phone she had kept close and dialed 911. Her voice, captured forever on tape, carried tremors of fear, yet beneath the quaver was a composure that startled investigators later. She told the dispatcher her parents had been shot, that men had broken in, that she was tied and helpless. Her words painted her as a victim, cornered and powerless, yet her tone, steady in places where panic should have overwhelmed, left a trace of doubt. The recording is chilling even today. Jennifer, please hurry. They shot my parents. I don't know what to do. I'm tied upstairs. Please come. The dispatcher's calm voice steadied the call, asking her to remain on the line, to give details, to describe what she could hear. Jennifer responded quickly, almost too quickly, answering questions with precision, as though rehearsed. She described the men as strangers, described herself as bound and unable to move, and repeated her pleas for help. To the police rushing toward the address, it sounded like a desperate daughter clinging to control in the middle of chaos. To those who listened later, it sounded like something else entirely. Downstairs, a tragedy had unfolded in minutes. Bitch Pan lay lifeless, her future stolen by bullets arranged in shadows. Han, though bleeding heavily from multiple wounds, was not gone. Against all odds, he clung to life, his breaths ragged, his body broken, but his will refusing to surrender. That survival would become the fault line on which Jennifer's story would eventually fracture. For now, though, only Jennifer's voice filled the air, echoing from the 911 tape that would play again and again in courtrooms and documentaries. It was the voice of a daughter presenting herself as a prisoner in her own home. But what if the person tied up was never really a prisoner at all? When police first arrived at the Pan residence on November 8, 2010, they were met with chaos. One parent dead, another gravely wounded, and a daughter tied upstairs, crying into a phone as she begged for help. It looked, in those early moments, like a violent robbery gone wrong, the kind of random suburban horror that terrifies every family living on a quiet street. Jennifer Pan was treated as a victim. She was comforted, taken to safety, and told she had survived something unspeakable. But the scene, even in its confusion, left investigators with questions that refused to settle. As officers swept the home, they noticed what wasn't there. There were no splintered door frames, no broken locks, no smashed windows. Entry had been smooth, almost cooperative, and that alone was strange. In a typical invasion, force is loud and messy. Here, the house looked eerily intact. Then came the next problem. Nothing valuable seemed missing. Jewelry sat untouched, electronics remained in place, and even wallets hadn't been cleared out. The house bore the scars of violence, but not of theft. A robbery with no robbery. For detectives, the pieces didn't fit. While investigators puzzled over the crime scene, a miracle unfolded in a hospital bed across town. Against all odds, Han Pan survived. He had been shot multiple times, one bullet lodged dangerously near his face, another in his neck, and yet he lived. Slowly, painfully, he regained enough strength to speak. What he said shifted the entire investigation. From his hospital bed, his voice faint but insistent, Han told detectives. They spoke to Jennifer like they knew her. These words cut through every assumption the police had made. If the attackers had been strangers, why would they have addressed his daughter as if she was familiar? Detectives returned to the 911 call and listened again. Jennifer's tone had seemed trembling, yet it carried a steadiness that unsettled them. She had been tied to the banister with a shoelace, but the knot was loose, simple enough that investigators later wondered if it had been more staged than restraint. In her first interview, taken the night of the shooting, she had told her story smoothly, almost too smoothly, hitting the same phrases with practiced ease. Now, paired with Han's recollection, the performance seemed brittle. Victims often stumble in their retelling, shaken by memory. Jennifer had been precise, consistent, and rehearsed. Technology brought sharper answers. When detectives pulled Jennifer's phone records, the flood of messages on the night of the crime stunned them. Dozens of texts passed between her and Daniel Wong in the hours leading up to 10 p.m. The timestamps lined up almost perfectly with the movements of the intruders. At 9:35 p.m., she texted Daniel. Her parents were home. At 9:46, Daniel responded, "We're close." At 10:02, the house was breached. This wasn't coincidence. It was a script, and her phone was the director's board. Still, police knew suspicion wasn't enough. They needed her to unravel her own story. A second interview was arranged, and this time, the tone was different. Jennifer sat across from detectives who had already seen her phone records and already spoken to her father. The questions pressed closer, circling the same events from multiple angles. How had the men entered? Why hadn't valuables been taken? Why had she been tied so loosely? Her responses, once steady, began to crack. She contradicted herself on timelines. She repeated stock phrases, as if reciting lines rather than recalling memories. When asked about her constant text to Daniel that night, she stumbled. The collapse was subtle at first, then complete. The picture of a helpless daughter could no longer hold. Forensics tightened the noose further. Surveillance cameras from nearby streets captured the dark vehicle carrying the intruders as it arrived at the Pan home and then sped away. GPS data from phones tied to Daniel's circle placed the men in the neighborhood at the exact time the crime occurred. These were not vague suspicions. They were coordinates, timestamps, and video frames. Cold, impartial, irrefutable. Together with Han's testimony, they built a wall around Jennifer's version of events, a wall through which no explanation could break. And through it all, the emotional toll remained inescapable. Han lay in recovery, his body broken but his mind clear, grieving the loss of his wife and learning, piece by piece, that his daughter was not the victim he thought she was. Bitch was gone, killed instantly in her own basement. And Jennifer, the daughter they had trusted, was now the central figure in a case that had turned from tragedy to betrayal. By the close of 2010, detectives no longer saw a robbery gone wrong. They saw a conspiracy built from texts, money transfers, and a daughter's desperation turned to calculation. Jennifer had called 911 claiming she was bound and helpless. But the evidence told a different story. She had never been a prisoner that night. By 2011, the investigation had closed its circle. Police arrested Jennifer Pan, her boyfriend Daniel Wong, and the three men who had entered the Pan home with guns that November night. Mugshots replaced school photos, and headlines that once described Jennifer as a survivor now called her an accused killer. The young woman who had dialed 911 in a trembling voice was no longer the grieving daughter. She was charged as the orchestrator of her mother's murder and her father's attempted execution. It would take 3 more years for the case to reach trial. When proceedings finally opened in 2014, the courthouse in Newmarket, Ontario, was filled with tension. Reporters packed benches, true crime followers whispered outside the courtroom, and the Pan family's tragedy was debated in living rooms across Canada. Was Jennifer a fragile daughter pushed past endurance, or a calculating architect of death? That was the question the jury was called to decide. The prosecution's opening statement was clear. Jennifer Pan had been the mastermind. She was the one who unlocked the door, the one who texted instructions, the one who paid for violence and staged her role as a bound victim. To prove it, they laid out the evidence piece by piece. Jurors saw Jennifer's text to Daniel at 9:35 p.m. "They're here." Minutes later, another message. "The door is unlocked." At 9:46, Daniel texted, "We're close." At 10:02, the armed men entered the house. Prosecutors replayed her 911 call, drawing attention to her oddly calm tone, pointing out how her words carried urgency, but her voice never rose into true panic. That is not the voice of a daughter in shock, the Crown argued. That is the voice of someone performing. The defense countered with a portrait that softened the edges of her actions. They argued that Jennifer had been raised in a cage of expectations, where failure was unthinkable and obedience the only language of love. They described a household where Han's rules left no space for independence, where piano keys and report cards were weighed heavier than joy. Her deceptions, they claimed, were the survival strategies of a child desperate to please. They pointed to Daniel as a dominant influence, saying he was older, persuasive, and the one who led her toward a plan she never fully understood. Their strategy was not to deny her involvement, but to frame her as manipulated, pressured, and broken down by years of control. Inside the courtroom, the clash was more than legal. It became a cultural battleground, immigrant parental expectations versus the pursuit of individual freedom. Experts testified about the weight carried by children of immigrant families, about the silent pressure to succeed, about the shame of failure. The Crown pushed back, insisting that strict parenting did not excuse murder. The defense insisted that without understanding Jennifer's upbringing, the jury could not understand her desperation. It was not only Jennifer on trial. It was also a question of how far control can go before it fractures the family it was meant to protect. Jennifer herself sat at the defense table each day, her dark hair framing a face that betrayed little. Some days, she wept silently as evidence was read. Other days, she stared ahead, her expression flat, showing none of the grief one might expect of a daughter mourning her mother. Jurors watched her closely, studying whether her tears seemed real, whether her stillness seemed rehearsed. In a trial built on deception, every gesture carried meaning. The most devastating testimony came not from experts or lawyers, but from Hanpan himself. He entered the courtroom slowly, his body still carrying the scars of bullet wounds that would never fully heal. Standing before the jury, his voice quiet but unshaken, he spoke of the life he had built, the wife he had lost, and the daughter who had betrayed him. "I lost my wife," he said, pausing as the room held its breath. "And I lost my daughter." The words silenced the court. There was no cross-examination that could soften their weight. For Han, survival had not been victory. It was the burden of living with a loss that had no end. Public fascination with the case grew as testimony unfolded. Commentators debated the meaning of parental discipline, the limits of control, and whether Jennifer was a villain or a victim of her upbringing. In Asian Canadian communities, the case struck even deeper, sparking difficult conversations about cultural expectations and the fragile line between sacrifice and suffocation. Some defended Han's discipline as the reason his family had survived and thrived. Others saw in Jennifer's deception a warning about what happens when love is measured only in achievement. The trial was no longer just a criminal proceeding. It was a mirror held up to a nation. When closing arguments were made, the jury was presented with two versions of Jennifer Pan. The Crown described a cold planner, a daughter who arranged her parents' deaths with precision. The defense described a broken young woman, a prisoner of parental control manipulated by a boyfriend who promised escape. Both stories were heavy, but only one could define her fate. On November 14, 2014, the verdict was read. Jennifer Pan was found guilty of first-degree murder in the killing of her mother and guilty of attempted murder in the shooting of her father. Daniel Wong and the three accomplices were also convicted. Jennifer sat motionless as the words were spoken, her eyes lowered, her future rewritten in the space of a sentence. The girl who had once been praised as the model daughter was now condemned as the mastermind of one of the most shocking crimes in Canadian history. The sentence followed swiftly: life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. For Jennifer, it meant that she would not be eligible for release until middle age, and even then, her fate would be in the hands of a parole board weighing her crimes against any claim of rehabilitation. For Han, the sentence was both everything and nothing. Justice had been delivered, but his wife was gone forever, and his daughter, in his words, was lost to him. He cut off all contact, telling the court in his victim statement that the daughter he had raised no longer existed. As the trial ended, the cameras faded and the jury dispersed, but the questions remained. Was Jennifer Pan a child destroyed by expectation, or a woman who chose calculation over compassion? Was she cornered, or was she cold? The courtroom had delivered its verdict, but the story continued to live in the uneasy space between cultural tragedy and criminal betrayal. Jennifer Pan's lies had once shielded her from her father's judgment, her mother's disappointment, and her friend's curiosity. But in court, stripped of illusion, those lies could no longer protect her. They had become the very chains that bound her to a life behind bars. Jennifer Pan entered prison in 2014, not as the obedient daughter her parents once believed her to be, but as a convicted killer serving life without parole for 25 years. The routines of confinement replaced the double life she had built outside. Mornings were marked by head counts, afternoons by scheduled meals, evenings by the dull weight of locked doors. Other inmates described her as quiet, withdrawn, and cautious, often keeping to herself, rarely making eye contact. In prison, there was no stage left to perform on. Her lies had collapsed in court, and now she lived stripped of story, defined only by her crime. What haunted Jennifer most was not the concrete or the guards, but the silence from her family. Han, who had survived her plan, made it clear he would never speak to her again. In his victim statement, he said the daughter he loved no longer existed, and he held to those words. He visited his wife's grave, but not Jennifer's prison cell. Felix, her younger brother, also severed ties completely. He had lost his mother, nearly lost his father, and he chose to build a life without the sister who betrayed them both. Letters Jennifer sent from prison went unanswered, and requests for contact were ignored. She was alive, but in the eyes of her family, she was gone. Beyond the prison walls, the community struggled to make sense of the case. It was not only a murder trial, it became a cultural reckoning. Debates erupted in newspapers, classrooms, and homes about tiger parenting, the relentless pressure to achieve, common in many immigrant families. Some argued that Han and Bitch's discipline was rooted in sacrifice, born of their struggle to rebuild life in Canada after fleeing war. Others countered that the strictness had been suffocating, leaving Jennifer no room to fail, no space to be honest. Headlines called it a tragedy of control and deception, and commentators questioned whether expectations had turned into chains. The Pan case forced families across Canada to ask themselves how far discipline can go before it breaks the very bond it's meant to protect. Psychologists who studied the case pointed to the psychology of deception. Jennifer's life had been built on lies long before the night of the murder. It started with altered report cards and invented awards, each deception crafted to protect her from disappointment and preserve her parents' approval. Over time, those lies became a second identity, one she wore as naturally as her real name. By 2010, the deception was so deep that confession seemed impossible. In her mind, only removal of obstacles could keep the illusion intact. Her choice to plan her parents' deaths was not born in a single moment of rage, but in years of practiced fabrication. Lies had become her first language, and murder was its final, catastrophic grammar. And yet the case resists a simple explanation. Was Jennifer Pan a victim of her parents' control, a young woman so cornered by fear of failure that she believed violence was her only way out? Or was she the architect of her own destruction, a daughter who, step by step, chose deception, manipulation, and murder over truth? The jury decided her fate in law, but the moral debate endures. Parents see a warning about pushing too hard. Children see a warning about the cost of lying to preserve approval. And in between lies the uneasy truth. Jennifer was both trapped and responsible, both shaped by pressure and undone by her own hand. Meanwhile, Han continues his life carrying scars that cannot heal. He survived bullets that should have ended him, but survival brought grief rather than relief. Each visit to Bitch's grave is a reminder of love stolen by the very child they raised. Felix lives apart, quiet in the shadow of a tragedy he did not choose. Together, father and son bear the weight of a family shattered from within, a family whose greatest wound was not caused by strangers, but by someone they once trusted completely. The legacy of Jennifer Pan lingers in photographs and in silence. School portraits of her smiling in neat clothes appear beside images of her in prison uniform, her expression unreadable. Courtroom sketches capture her as both victim and villain, depending on who holds the pen. The Pan family home, once a symbol of sacrifice and hard work, is remembered as the scene of betrayal. In documentaries and news specials, Jennifer's story plays out again and again, a cautionary tale about lies, love, and the consequences of choices that cannot be undone. Sometimes, the greatest danger doesn't come from strangers, but from the ones we trust most.